dualism denotes the state of two parts. The term dualism was originally coined to denote co-eternal binary opposition, a meaning that is preserved in metaphysical and philosophical duality discourse but has been more generalized in other usages to indicate a system which contains two essential parts. Moral dualism is the belief of the great complement or conflict between the benevolent and the malevolent. It simply implies that there are two moral opposites at work, independent of any interpretation of what might be moral, and independent of how these may be represented. The moral opposites might, for example, exist in a worldview which has one God, more than one God, or none. By contrast, ditheism or bitheism implies two gods. While bitheism implies harmony, ditheism implies rivalry and opposition, such as between good and evil, or bright and dark, or summer and winter. For example, a ditheistic system would be one in which one god is creative, the other is destructive. Alternatively, in ontological dualism, the world is divided into two overarching categories. The opposition and combination of the universe's two basic principles of yin and yang is a large part of Chinese philosophy, and is an important feature of Taoism, both as a philosophy and as a religion. In theology, dualism can refer to the relationship between God and creation. The Christian dualism of God and creation exists in some traditions of Christianity, like Paulicianism, Catholicism, and Gnosticism. The Paulicians, a Byzantine Christian sect, believe that the universe, created through evil, exists separately from a moral God. The Dvaita Vedanta school of Indian philosophy also espouses a dualism between God and the universe. The first and the more important reality is that of Vishnu or Brahman. Vishnu is the Supreme Self, God, the absolute truth of the universe, the independent reality. The second reality is that of dependent but equally real universe that exists with its own separate essence. In Wicca, dualism is represented in the common Wiccan belief in a god and a goddess, a dual partnership in ruling the universe. In philosophy of mind, dualism is a view about the relationship between mind and matter which claims that mind and matter are two ontologically separate categories. Mind-body dualism claims that neither the mind nor matter can be reduced to each other in any way. Western dualist philosophical traditions equate mind with the conscious self and theorize on consciousness on the basis of mind-body dualism. By contrast, some Eastern philosophies draw a metaphysical line between consciousness and matter, where matter includes both body and mind. In philosophy of science, dualism often refers to the dichotomy between the subject and the object. Another dualism, in Popperian philosophy of science, refers to hypothesis and refutation. This notion also carried to Popper's political philosophy. In physics, dualism also refers to media with properties that can be associated with the mechanics of two different phenomena. Because these two phenomena's mechanics are mutually exclusive, both are needed in order to describe the possible behaviors. An example of using two different physical models to describe one phenomenon is wave-particle duality. In cybernetics, Norbert Wiener described Manichean devils as those systems or problems in which an intelligent adversary is attempting to exploit weaknesses of the investigator. Wiener's cybernetics contrasted such systems with Augustinian devils, that were systems or problems that, though very complex and difficult to figure out, did not feature an adversary with contrary intent. Victories or expansions of knowledge in such systems were able to be built upon incrementally through science. Wiener noted that temporary weaknesses were not fatal in attempts to defeat Augustinian devils because another experiment could simply be pursued. Wiener further noted that temporary lapses in judgment against Manichean devils were more often fatal or destructive, due to the desire of the opponent to win, survive at all costs, even going so far as to introduce any level of deception into the system. Although this duality between complexity and opposition may seem obvious, there are deep implications in many areas of science. such as game theory, political science, computer science, network science, security science, military science, evolutionary biology, cryptography, etc. Moral dualism. Moral dualism is the belief of the great complement or conflict between the benevolent and the malevolent. Like ditheism, bitheism, moral dualism does not imply the absence of monist or monotheistic principles. Moral dualism simply implies that there are two moral opposites at work, independent of any interpretation of what might be moral, and, unlike ditheism, bitheism, independent of how these may be represented. For example, Mazdaism is both dualistic and monotheistic, since in that philosophy God, the creator, is purely good, and the antithesis, which is also uncreated, is an absolute one. Zervanism, Manichaeism and Mandeism are representative of dualistic and monist philosophies, since each has a supreme intranscendental first principle from which the two equal but opposite entities then emanate. This is also true for the lesser-known Christian Gnostic religions, such as Bogomils, Catholicism, and so on. More complex forms of monist dualism also exist, for instance in Hermeticism, where nous, thought that is described to have created man, brings forth both good and evil, dependent on interpretation, whether it receives prompting from the god or from the demon. Duality with pluralism is considered a logical fallacy. History. Moral dualism began as a theological belief. Dualism was first seen implicitly in Egyptian religious beliefs by the contrast of the gods Set and Osiris. The first explicit conception of dualism came from the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism around the mid-5th century BC. Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion that believes that Ahura Mazda is the eternal creator of all good things. Any violations of Ahura Mazda's order arise from Druj, which is everything uncreated. From this comes a significant choice for humans to make. Either they fully participate in human life for Ahura Mazda, or they do not and give Druj power. Personal dualism is even more distinct in the beliefs of later religions. The religious dualism of Christianity between good and evil is not a perfect dualism, as God will inevitably destroy Satan. Early Christian dualism is largely based on Platonic dualism. There is also a personal dualism in Christianity with a soul-body distinction based on the idea of an immaterial Christian soul. Duotheism, bitheism, ditheism. In theology, dualism may also refer to duotheism, bitheism, or ditheism. Although ditheism, bitheism imply moral dualism, they are not equivalent. Ditheism, bitheism implies two gods, while moral dualism does not imply any theism whatsoever. Both bitheism and ditheism imply a belief in two equally powerful gods with complementary or antinomous properties. However, while bitheism implies harmony, ditheism implies rivalry and opposition, such as between good and evil, or bright and dark, or summer and winter. For example, a ditheistic system would be one in which one god is creative, the other is destructive. In the original conception of Zoroastrianism, for example, Ahura Mazda was the spirit of ultimate good, while Ahriman was the spirit of ultimate evil. One well-known example of a bitheistic or duotheistic theology based on gender polarity is found in the neo-pagan religion of Wicca, which is centered on the worship of a divine couple, the moon goddess and the horned god, who are regarded as lovers. However, there is also a ditheistic theme within traditional Wicca, as the horned god has dual aspects of bright and dark, relating to day, night, summer, winter, expressed as the Oak King and the Holly King, who in Wiccan myth and ritual are said to engage in battle twice a year for the hand of the goddess, resulting in the changing seasons. However, bitheistic and ditheistic principles are not always so easily contrastable. For instance, in a system where one god is the representative of summer and drought and the other of winter and rain, fertility. Martianism, an early Christian sect, held that the Old and New Testaments were the work of two opposing gods. Both were first principles, but of different religions. Ontological dualism. Alternatively, dualism can mean the tendency of humans to perceive and understand the world as being divided into two overarching categories. In this sense, it is dualistic when one perceives a tree as a thing separate from everything surrounding it. This form of ontological dualism exists in Taoism and Confucianism, beliefs that divide the universe into the complementary oppositions of yin and yang. In traditions such as classical Hinduism, Zen Buddhism or Islamic Sufism, a key to enlightenment is transcending this sort of dualistic thinking, without merely substituting dualism with monism or pluralism. In Chinese philosophy, the opposition and combination of the universe's two basic principles of yin and yang is a large part of Chinese philosophy, and is an important feature of Taoism, both as a philosophy and as a religion. Yin and yang is also discussed in Confucianism, but to a lesser extent. Some of the common associations with yang and yin, respectively, are male and female, light and dark, active and passive, motion and stillness. The yin and yang symbol in actuality has very little to do with Western dualism. Instead, it represents the philosophy of balance, where two opposites coexist in harmony and are able to transmute into each other. In the yin-yang symbol there is a dot of yin and yang and a dot of yang and yin. This symbolizes the interconnectedness of the opposite forces as different aspects of Tao, the first principle. Contrast is needed to create a distinguishable reality, without which we would experience nothingness. Therefore, the independent principles of yin and yang are actually dependent on one another for each other's distinguishable existence. The complementary dualistic concept in Taoism represents the reciprocal interaction throughout nature, related to a feedback loop, where opposing forces do not exchange in opposition but instead exchange reciprocally to promote stabilization, similar to homeostasis. An underlying principle in Taoism states that within every independent entity lies a part of its opposite. Within sickness lies health and vice versa. This is because all opposites are manifestations of the single Tao, and are therefore not independent from one another, but rather a variation of the same unifying force throughout all of nature. Mind-matter and mind-body dualism. In philosophy of mind dualism is any of a narrow variety of views about the relationship between mind and matter, which claims that mind and matter are two ontologically separate categories. In particular, mind-body dualism claims that neither the mind nor matter can be reduced to each other in any way, and thus is opposed to materialism in general, and reductive materialism in particular. Mind-body dualism can exist as substance dualism, which claims that the mind and the body are composed of a distinct substance, and as property dualism, which claims that there may not be a distinction in substance, but that mental and physical properties are still categorically distinct, and not reducible to each other. This type of dualism is sometimes referred to as mind and body, and stands in contrast to philosophical monism, which views mind and matter as being ultimately the same kind of thing. See also Cartesian dualism, substance dualism, epiphenomenalism. In Buddhist philosophy during the classical era of Buddhist philosophy in India, philosophers such as Dharma argue for a dualism between states of consciousness and Buddhist atoms. According to the standard interpretation of Dharma Buddhist metaphysics, typically in Western philosophy, dualism is considered to be a dualism between mind and brain, which ultimately involves mind interacting with the physical brain, and therefore also interacting with the microparticles that make up the brain tissue. Buddhist dualism, in Dharma sense, is different in that it is not a dualism between the mind and brain, but rather between states of consciousness and basic building blocks. Like many Buddhists from 600–1000 CE, Dharma philosophy involved Mariological nihilism, meaning that other than states of consciousness, the only things that exist are momentary quantum particles, much like the particles of quantum physics. History. The first significant argument against dualism came from Thomas Hobbes's materialist critique of the human person. Hobbes argues that all of human experience comes from biological processes contained within the body. In response to Hobbes, the French philosopher René Descartes developed Cartesian dualism, which posits that there is a divisible, mechanical body and an indivisible, immaterial mind which interact with one another. The body perceives external inputs and the awareness of them comes from the soul. The point of interaction between the two is at the pineal gland in the brain. During the 19th and 20th centuries, materialistic monism became the norm. Still, in addition to already discussed theories of dualism, there are new theories in the defense of dualism. Naturalistic dualism comes from Australian philosopher David Chalmers, who argues there is an explanatory gap between objective and subjective experience that cannot be bridged by reductionism because consciousness is, at least, logically autonomous of the physical properties upon which it supervenes. According to Chalmers, a naturalistic account of property dualism requires a new fundamental category of properties described by new laws of supervenience, the challenge being analogous to that of understanding electricity based on the mechanistic and Newtonian models of materialism prior to Maxwell's equations. A similar defense comes from Australian philosopher Frank Jackson, who revived the theory of epiphenomenalism, which argues that mental states do not play a role in physical states. Jackson argues that there are two kinds of dualism. The first is substance dualism that assumes there is a second, non-corporeal form of reality. In this form, body and soul are two different substances. The second form is property dualism that says that body and soul are different properties of the same body. He claims that functions of the mind, soul are internal, very private experiences that are not accessible to observation by others, and therefore not accessible by science. We can know everything, for example, about a bat's facility for echolocation, but we will never know how the bat experiences that phenomenon. In Jackson's mind experiment, he imagines a girl who grows up in a black and white room. She may grow up learning all about the scientific facts of colors, but has no way of experiencing colors other than black or white. When someone brings a red tomato into her room, she is stunned. She discovers a new fact. The experience of red is like this. That experience is not a physical fact but a conscious one. Soul dualism. In some cultures, people are believed to have two kinds of soul. In several cases, one of these souls is associated with body functions, and the other one is able to leave the body. The plethora of soul types may be even more complex. The bipartite view of theology recognizes the existence of both material and immaterial aspects of human life, typically body and soul. This is distinct from the tripartite view that holds soul and spirit to be separate aspects of a person along with the body.